to another exciting episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Wes Bryan, and in today's episode, we're continuing along in our VMware series. More specifically, we're looking at the VMware Certified Professional version 6. Back in the studio today to help us out with this topic is none other than Mr. Don Pezet. Don, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, Wes. Ready to dive right back into VCP. And you know, in our previous episodes, we've really been focusing on getting things set up, right? Installing ESX, installing vCenter, just kind of turning things on. Well, once everything's turned on, now we've got to shift our focus over to security. And so for the next couple of episodes, we're going to be focusing on securing the whole vSphere suite. So ESXi hosts, vCenter server, all these different pieces. There's certain security steps that we need to take. And so where I want to start today is with permissions. When you install ESX, you create one user account, root, right? It's created for you. You have no choice. When you install vCenter, it creates one user account called administrator. Both of those accounts, root and administrator, have full and complete access. Root has full and complete access to an ESXi host. Administrator has full and complete access to vSphere as a whole, so vCenter as well as ESXi hosts. And that's just a lot of access. Now, if you're a small environment, you only have one IT guy, that might work out. But if you have 1,000 ESX hosts and you've got 10,000 virtual machines and you've got tons of network admins in place, you don't want everybody sharing one account, because if one person gets terminated, now you have to change the password and everybody gets affected. Or you hire somebody new and you got to share that password. Now you go looking in the logs to find out who did something wrong, but everybody's logged in with the same account, so you don't know who did what. So it's really important that we create user accounts for each person that's going to be administering our system. Now in this episode, I'm going to focus specifically on creating those user accounts and assigning permissions and using groups and roles. I want to focus on that side. In the next episode, we're going to get a chance to see integrating this with something like the Microsoft Active Directory, the single sign-on piece that makes a lot of this work. But I want to focus on the permission side first, and then we'll get into the whole single sign-on mess next. I shouldn't say mess. It's actually really easy to implement, and it does a great job. So I shouldn't I shouldn't call it a mess. But yeah, so that's what we're going to tackle here is permissions, getting things set up the right way, and we always want to do that early on instead of regretting it later and not being able to go back in time.
You know, Don, when we talked before the episode started, I asked you a question about roles and permissions, and coming from a different environment, I always think of end users and stuff. And you had a real great explanation here. And when we talk about roles, we're talking about things like delegation of administration, right?
Yeah, and that's a key thing, because you're going to have different people who perform a different role in your organization. So for example, let's say you're a massive company. You've got 10,000 employees, you've got a ton of virtual machines, a ton of hosts, you're a big company. Well, you may have employees that are dedicated just to be vSphere administrators, right? So I am just a vSphere administrator and that's it. I don't work on Active Directory, I don't work on other software products, I just work on vSphere and that's it. I then have other employees that do the Active Directory side. I have other employees that are developers. I have other employees that are help desk, and they each have their own different role within the organization. The smaller your company is, the more likely it is that you wear more hats, right? So if you're at a company that only has 300 employees and you have 2 IT guys, that's very, very common, then you wear all the hats. So you might be the administrator for Active Directory and the administrator for vSphere and the administrator for all this other stuff. So just having a big fat administrator account, that works, that is okay. But the bigger your company is, the more risk that creates. And so we've got to have a separation of duties. We don't want to give people more access than they absolutely need. And VMware, they've kind of set a lot of this up for us. When you do a default install of vSphere in vCenter, vCenter has a series of groups that, I have to be careful here because the terminology changes. Different vendors use different terminologies, and in vCenter we have groups and we have roles, and those sound very similar, but they are different. So let's talk about that. There's really 3 objects I'm going to work with in this episode: users, groups, and roles. A user, that's a person, right? So Wes, me, it's an employee typically, but it could be a contractor or a guest or whatever, but it's a person. That's a user. And then a group is simply a collection of those users, and that's it. In other systems, like in Linux, we might have those groups that we assign permissions to, or we might have it in Windows, where you have groups you assign permissions to. But in VMware, when we're dealing with vCenter, we don't use the groups that way. Groups really just collect users together. And then we have roles. And roles, That's what we're really assigning permissions to, and we attach users and groups to the roles. So they've pre-built some roles in for us to be able to use, and you can use them, or you can create your own. Let's kind of walk through that. So I'm logged into vSphere right here, and so I'm in my my vCenter web client. And inside of the web client, we've got all the various different things that we kind of mess around with. And what I'm looking for is administration. And when you go into administration, you'll start to see users and groups, right, where we can jump in and start to control that. But even above that, you've got roles. And so they are separated out. Users and groups, those are the actual people and collections of people. But roles, those are where we're assigning people permissions to do things. And you can see right here the default roles. I did not make a single role before the show. So every role you see here on my screen is one that was created as a default on this system, okay? And the administrator role, that's kind of the key one. That one's important. And when I click on it, see how it's got a bunch of people in it? It says that it's defined in the global policies, and so I've got global permissions there. And if I look at the user and group, I'll see that it's got a bunch of vSphere.local accounts tied to it, right? That's the default. That vSphere, the admin at vSphere local account that I keep logging in with, that's the default account, and it's getting its permissions right here, so I can find the administrator in here, all right? Now the administrator role has permissions assigned to it, and that's we can see that right here under the Privileges tab. When I go under Privileges, I see everything that an administrator can do. If it has a check mark by it, I can do it. If it has nothing by it, I can't do it, right? So this is basically going through and saying what we can do. Well, an administrator can do anything, right? They're the all-powerful account. So I'm going to see check marks on everything. And see what it says down here, description, all privileges. That's what an administrator has. An administrator has everything. And they give you the nice big general permissions right here, but if you expand it out, you can see a little bit more. So when we go under like, let's find virtual machines. So if I find virtual machines right here, and I expand that out, I can see permissions inside of it. So I can see configuring a virtual machine or interacting with the virtual machine. If I look at interaction, we can see answering a question. Well, what's that about? Well, when I get one of those little support warnings and I can acknowledge it or decline it, right? Those are the questions. We've got backup operations, configure CD media, configure floppy media. If I have a check mark up here on interaction, I get all of the interaction permissions. But that might not be checked and just some sub items are. And now I'm just getting those limited permissions on it. I might have an employee who I want to be able to change the CD out in a virtual machine, but I don't want them to be able to shut it down, right? And we'll see that's kind of tucked away in here somewhere. There, oh, I just went past it. There it is, power on, power off. I don't want them to power it on and power it off, or maybe I'm okay with power on. Hey, the machine got turned off, you can go ahead and turn it on, but I don't want you turning it off. And you can change the CD, but I don't want you to do these other things. We can pick and choose. That's what these roles are all about. The administrator is actually the only one that's used by default. So when I choose administrator, I see all these things that are inside of it. If I start looking at the next couple of ones, like read only, the list is empty. No access, the list is empty, right? So these other ones aren't actually used. They're there for us to use. We can choose. Do I want somebody to have read-only access, right? Read-only access is really helpful for help desk employees, right? I might have a help desk employee that's entry level, somebody right out of college or high school or whatever, and they're getting into IT, and I want them so that when somebody calls in a ticket and says, hey, I can't connect to this server, I might want them to be able to connect to vCenter, log in, find that virtual machine and see if it's powered on. I don't want them to change anything. I just want them to look. And so I can use that read-only role to do that. I can give them that role, and now they'll be able to read just everything inside of vCenter, but they can't change a single thing. Or no access. I might explicitly want to block somebody. Why would I want to do that? Well, when we assign permissions, permissions trickle down. There's like inheritance that happens. And so I can assign permissions on a data center, and there might be 50 hosts inside of that data center. Well, if I give somebody permissions at the data center level, it trickles down to all the hosts inside of it. So if I give help desk read-only at the data center level, then the read-only permission trickles down to every single host inside of that data center. What if I have a host in there that is for human resources? And I don't want just the regular old help desk being able to get into the human resources server. right? Even just read-only. I don't want them to be able to see that. So I might need to go to that specific server and override it and say help desk gets no access on that particular server. So that's why we've got this one. You can kind of take away people's access if you need it. Now the other ones that you'll see, you'll notice that they have a little parentheses and they say sample, right? These are just examples that VMware is giving you. You take them or leave them. You don't have to use them. I might want a virtual machine user. That's somebody who can't administer vCenter. They can't add hosts or do maintenance on a host, but they can use a virtual machine. And if you take a look at the privileges that are assigned, see how a lot of this stuff is not checked. So under alarms, they've got nothing. Under auto deploy, certificates, content library, data center, data store, all this stuff is nothing, no check mark. But if I get down to global, for example, see how I've got that little half square? That's letting me know that I have some permissions inside of global. Not all. If it was all, I'd have a check mark, but I have some. And if I keep scrolling down and get to the virtual machine section, that's where we'll see the best stuff. So if I get down to virtual machine, right, I don't have configure. I can't configure a virtual machine and change its settings, but I can interact with it. I can interact and answer a question. I can't do a backup, but you'll see configure CD media, console interaction, so I can view the screen of the VM. I can work with the VM. We're picking and choosing those privileges. Now, one thing you might have noticed as I've been in here is it doesn't always give me the ability to edit these. If I choose administrator, for example, see how the pencil grayed out? I can't edit it. VMware does not want you to edit the default roles. And by they don't want you to, I mean they make it where you can't. So I can't edit the administrator roles. I can't edit read-only. I can't edit no access. Those are system built-in ones. But when I get to the sample, the little edit button lights up and I can edit the sample. All right. Now in real life land, you're welcome to edit the samples if you want, but VMware recommends you don't. And so on the exam, remember that we don't want to edit the existing roles. Use the roles as they are. If you need something different, it's better to clone a role and edit your own. So you can create custom roles. And all you have to do is pick the role you want to base things on. So for example, I might have help desk, and I want the help desk role to be like a modification of read-only. I want them to have read-only to everything, but I also want them to be able to interact with certain virtual machines or whatever, have certain capabilities on a VM. So I could take read-only, and I could hit the duplicate button up here. And when I hit the clone role action, it's going to clone it, and I'm creating a clone of read-only. And I'm going to call this help desk, because these are going to be customized privileges just for help desk. And as you look down here at what we end up with, notice how nothing is checked. Read-only is actually the default. Okay, so everything is unchecked. And now I can go through and grant exactly what I want them to have. This isn't like no access where everything is being taken away. This one, we get read-only, and now we go through and we specify what they want. So under alarms, they're the help desk. So I might want them to be able to acknowledge an alarm, that an alarm was created and they can acknowledge it. Or maybe I don't want that. Maybe the help desk is just handling calls in, so I want them to be able to create an alarm, right? They got a call, this server is down, they create an alarm, and now the VMware admins see it and can start to work with it, all right? But they can't acknowledge an alarm because they're not supposed to be able to fix it on their own. So we can start to kind of tweak and change that. Maybe I wanted to set an alarm status, I probably don't. But you start picking and choosing based on what it is you want them to have. I probably don't want them to do auto deploy. Oop, I'm getting a little scroll happy on this one. On the data center and data stores, I probably don't want them to do anything there. On the virtual machine side, though, and even on the host side, there might be permissions that I want to give there, especially when it comes to things like reporting, right? So as I go down here to inventory, you'll see where we've got add, modify, remove. I more than likely don't want that stuff. Actually, there's not really anything in there I'd want to give to a help desk employee. I guess it depends on how much you trust the employee. But if you browse through here, you'll see there's a ton of settings, and there's a ton of different things that you can dole out and give to people, and it's all based on what you want. So you can create your own custom privileges. You might want to take certain things away, grant certain things, and you build up that custom role. So remember, this is the way that I always keep it straight, is that roles are all about permissions. Okay, it's all about permissions. So I'm defining a role based on the permissions that I want to give. So I now have a role called help desk, And it's got all the permissions I want my help desk employees to have. So they've got read-only for the whole environment, and they can create an alarm. So now they're set the way that I want them, and I just need to make sure that my help desk employees will have that permission.
You know, Don, you mentioned in an earlier explanation here how if you set a privilege or a permission at a certain level, it'll inherit or trickle down. Well, when you have permissions set at multiple places, can it be a little tricky as to determining what permission the end result might be?
Absolutely. You know, it's the propagation of permissions. So what you can have is where, you know, maybe I give Wes read only at the data center level, and then Wes calls me up, Don, I'm logged in. I can read from some servers, I can't read from others. What's going on? Well, you go and you look, and it turns out it's overridden somewhere. That yes, he had read at the domain level, at the data center level, but it's been overridden on a virtual machine. So now you're like, well, shoot, now I got to go find which virtual machine it's overridden at and overdo that. So it gets to be challenging. And the recommendation is that when you talk about your hierarchy, right? Your hierarchy works like this. You have your global permissions, and then underneath that you have your vCenter permissions, and underneath that you have your data centers, and underneath that you have your hosts. And so at each step along that journey, we can override permissions. So the recommendation is to set permissions as high up in that hierarchy as possible. For somebody like my help desk, I might want them to read from the entire environment, not just one particular vCenter server, not just one particular data center, but the whole shebang. And for that, we have global permissions. And so I'll jump into the global permissions here in a moment. Well, actually, am I still on that screen? No, I'm not on the screen anymore. I'll get to global permissions in a little bit. Global permissions are ones that we set all the way up at the top. But otherwise, oh, actually I am on that screen, shoot. If I would pay a little more attention here. So I basically went to home, administration, and roles. That's where I was. If I went to home, administration, and global permissions right here, this is where I can set global permissions that apply to my entire environment. And see how it's kind of showing that here in the picture is that we've got vCenter, which is what it's representing with that server, and the host and the virtual machines that are inside of it, all trickling down. If I give people permissions at this level, it applies to my entire environment. If you have a small company, that's probably all you need. All your permissions get set right here. But the bigger your company is, the less likely this is to be true. That you're more than likely to be assigning permissions all over the place. And you can certainly do that. In fact, what we've done so far, I created a role, but I don't really have anybody in that role. So I kind of need to get some users set up and put them in the role and so on. So let's do that, and then I'll show you assigning the permissions, and we'll kind of get to it all from there. So in order for this to really be useful, I need to put some users in the role. Okay, and the way we do users, there's actually two different, well, I guess it's three different ways. One way is to create the users on the ESXi hosts. I don't recommend that. If you're doing standalone ESXi hosts, you can do that. But if you've got it all managed by vCenter, then it's better to do it the second way, which is to create them in vCenter. Creating a user in vCenter will apply to all of your hosts, and that's usually the better way to go about things. The third way is to connect to a directory service, and we'll see that in the single sign-on episode, that we could connect to like Active Directory, and now you've got all the users and groups from Active Directory already in place, so you don't need to create any here at all. We can just ignore the local ones and just use the Active Directory ones. But in my case, I'm not connected to an Active Directory, but I do have a vCenter, so I'm going to go ahead and create it right here. And so when we look at this, basically going from home to administration to single sign-on, I can go to users and groups. Now, I haven't configured single sign-on, right? I haven't configured single sign-on with an Active Directory. Well, that's true. That's an external database. But you do have single sign-on with the vCenter database. And if I have 20 hosts attached, all 20 share the users of vCenter. So even though it's just one product, it's still considered single sign-on. I have a single user account that I can use on all 20 of my hosts, and it'll work across the board. And this is where I'll see that default administrator account that was created during the install. You'll also see some other things like the Kerberos ticket granting ticket account that's there, the KRBTGT, and you'll see K/M, the waiter service, which is part of the scheduling. So you'll see other accounts that are system accounts. You really shouldn't mess with those. The administrator account's the only real user account that we have, the only one that we can really log in as and use. I can start to create more accounts. So I might create an account for myself. So I'll make, dpossett, and I'll give myself a super secret password. I'd say I'll give myself a super secret password. Apparently I wasn't clicked on the field. Let's try that again. There we go. And so I'm going to type in my password. I'll give it my first name and last name. You don't have to give it too awful much information. Like email address and description, that's optional. I can leave those out. So basically, I just want to punch this in here, and then I'll say OK, and that's going to create a user account. It's going to create the account right here in the vCenter directory. So there I've got a user account. And I can create one for Wes or whoever else I need. I can just sit here and continue to add these accounts. So I'll create a Wes Bryant account and give him a password. And we'll be in business. So here's Wes Bryant. All right. So now that I've got 2 accounts created, they're here, they're present, and I can start to use them. Sort of. They don't actually have permissions. So these 2 accounts are created. They'll be able to log into vCenter, but they won't be able to do anything, right? Because they just don't have any access by default. I've got to put them in a role before they have that access. Now, you can put a user straight into a role. You can do that. But it's not always the best thing to do. Sometimes it's easier to put the users into groups first. I might have an entire group of users that I want to add to a role. So for example, if Wes is going to be my help desk team, every time I add a new help desk employee, I might want that help desk employee to be in the help desk role so they get those permissions. Well, if I'm tied into Active Directory, that might already be done. So I can take the Active Directory group and stick that in the role. Or I can create groups right here. I could just manage Wes individually and stick them wherever, but I'm going to create a group to be able to support that. Now, notice up here this little drop-down box. I should have pointed this out and I didn't. If you drop that down, you've got 2 choices of what you're creating. And see how it's got vsphere.local? That's the vCenter user database. You've also got plab vc01. What is that? That's the name of my server. And so that would be creating a local Windows account. There's actually 3 different places we can get our user accounts from. There's the vCenter database or the ESXi database. There's the Windows database on the vCenter server. And then there's a remote directory like Active Directory or OpenLDAP, those guys. So 3 different places the user accounts can come from. I'm not connected to an Active Directory, so I don't see the 3rd one here. But I do see the first 2. If I had chosen this, these would be local Windows accounts. And there's administrator and guest, and those are the Windows accounts that are created. I don't want to use those. All right, same thing goes for groups though. So when I jump over to the Groups tab, I'm going to see groups that are right here in vCenter. And you'll see administrators and a few other ones, users and so on. These are groups that they've made. I can create my own group if I want, and I can create a group called Help Desk or whatever it is that I need to provide my functionality. Now I know what you're thinking. I've got a role called Help Desk. Why would I have a group also? Isn't this a little redundant? It can be. It can be redundant like this. We'll see, like once we have the Active Directory in place, it makes a lot more sense. But here, I can group these users together so that when it comes time to assign people to a role, I just stick that group in the role. And anytime I hire a new help desk employee, I just put them in this group, and they'll automatically be in the various roles that they need.
Don, that definitely seems like it would be important as you scale up and you've got a larger and larger environment, maintaining the consistencies between the groups and the roles that you're assigning those privileges or permissions.
It's easy to make that mistake. So if I hire a new help desk employee, and I'm like, all right, they need these 5 roles. I got to remember to do that, the 5 roles. If I hire the next help desk employee, what if I forget one? I put them in 4 of the roles, right? Or I put them in a 6th role by accident. Here, I hire a new help desk employee, I put them in the help desk group. And now they get whatever roles are assigned to that group. There's no room for error, right? It saves us from making that mistake and giving out more permissions than we should. So now that I've got a group made, so I've got that help desk group showing up right there, I can see the group members down here, and it's empty. So I'm just going to hit the little plus sign there to add some group members to it, and I can browse and find it. Now notice how it says show users first. You typically put users into a group, but you can put groups into a group also. We can nest things. So I might have IT admins as a group, and inside of it I might have IT admins North America, IT admins South America, IT admins Europe, right? Because I might have different IT admin teams for each continent or wherever my data centers are. And I might want to use those permissions when it applies to one particular data center, but then I want global permissions too. So you can nest the groups to create whatever hierarchy it is that you want. And so I can come in here and I can find me or Wes or whoever it is that I want to make in that help desk group. Let's find Wes. So I'm going to find Wes. I'm going to add him. And so now Wes is going to be in that group. And when I hit add, it just makes his name appear down here. And if I just say OK, that's going to add him. There we go. And so now Wes shows as a group member of Help Desk. And my account, I made an account for me. I might want to put myself in administrators. So I'll come down here to administrators, and I'll hit add. and I'm just going to add myself this time. And so I'll add that in and get that created. So now I'm going to be in the administrators group, and I'll have full access to the environment. Okay. So at this point, I've got my users. The users are placed into groups. I've got a role created that has the permissions that I want. Now I just need to tie them together. And this is where things, I find that most people have the hard time with this, is actually using it. Because what we're used to is in the Linux world or in the Windows world is that you go and you assign permissions to an object to the group. But here we've got the roles that sit in between. And so what happens is we can go to any object in our entire hierarchy and we can pull up the permissions on that object. And when we look at the permissions, we assign the user or group to a role at that time that we're assigning the permissions. You actually put them together. So we don't actually put the group in the role. We don't actually apply the role to the group. We apply them at the same time as the permissions. That's what ties it all together and creates that permission set. It gives us some real flexibility, but it's a bit of a mind twist for those of you that are used to the Linux or Windows world. It's just kind of a different way of doing things. So let's do, I know I'm running short on time here, so let's just do an example of global settings first, and then we'll do a part two and we'll tackle like individual settings and go a little more advanced there. But let's just say globally, I put Wes in the help desk group, right? And I created a role called help desk. And so I want to make sure that help desk has that read-only access for the entire environment, and they can create alarms for any piece inside of that environment. So I'm going to go to my global permissions option here. If I was coming from the home screen, it would be home, and then administration, and then global permissions. And here I can see permissions that are assigned to that entire environment. We saw these earlier. And you'll see where administrator and a few other people already have some permissions that are assigned. I'm going to add in some new permissions. And this is the permission screen that we'll see on a lot of different objects throughout the show. And the way it works is it's divided in two halves. The part on the left side, are the users or groups that I want to assign permissions to. And then on the right side are the role that I want to give them on whatever object this is. Now I'm in the global permission, so this is really every object, but later on we'll see it might be a specific virtual machine or a specific ESXi host. This one's bigger. Okay. So on the left side, I need to pick the user or group, and I can have more than one if I want, all right? And so I'm going to come in here and choose, I might want to add Wes specifically or me specifically, but if I do it that way, every time I add a new help desk employee, I would have to come here and add them in too, right? And if I'm doing this in 20 different places, I have to go 20 different places and add that employee. Adding a group makes that a little less painful, and so that's usually the way that we want to go. Now I just hire the new employee and I put him in the group. So when I come in here, I can tell it to show me the groups first, and then I can find that help desk group that I made. And so I'll take help desk and I'm going to add that one to the list. All right. And so I'm adding that, and you can see I can do users. You can do multiple ones at the same time too. It might not just be help desk. I might also want to do things like my DC admins or license servers. Some of these other ones that I didn't make, but that were here before. I might want to add me specifically, right? So I can choose dpossett and I'll add myself. So now I'm actually adding a mixture of users and groups at the same time, and I'll go ahead and hit OK on that. And now we show up over here on the left. Now we have to be careful because look what role it assigned. So I've got, who's first here? dpossett. So I'm first, and then the help desk group is next. If I choose myself, it's made me an administrator. Well, I'm okay with that. I'm actually in the administrator group, so I could have achieved the same thing. I'm an administrator anyway, but I can assign the administrator role, and I'll get all of these privileges. If I click on help desk, though, it's an administrator also. And that might not necessarily be what I want. I want them to have the role that I custom built, right? The one that makes them read only, but they can also create alarms. And so I can drop down the role list and I can pick what role I want them to have. And so if I scroll down and find my help desk role, I'll see the permissions displayed here. I can't edit the permissions on the screen. I just see them. It's like a preview, so I know what I'm about to give. And I'll see where create alarm is checked. And so now help desk is going to be in that help desk role, and they'll be able to assign those permissions. Now it's a little bit hard to see here because the way the columns collapse, but help desk is this bottom row. If I resize this, in the role column I can see where I'm an administrator and they're help desk. I'm giving that role out to the appropriate settings, so I don't want to give them more permissions than what they absolutely need. All right, and so you can continue to add more groups here, and each group can be assigned to different roles, or they might even be assigned to the same role. Who knows? I might have another group here that's like IT auditors, and so I give them the help desk role because I know that'll give them read-only with create alarms. Now, I named my role based on a job function, help desk. I just chose to do that. A lot of people choose to name the roles based on the permissions. So I might have created a role called read-only and create alarms. And now it makes a little more sense. Like, I want the IT auditors to be able to read only and create alarms. I want the help desk to be able to read only and create alarms. It makes a little more sense than saying I want the IT auditors to be in the help desk role, right? So you need to think about how you're going to use the permissions to figure out how you want to name it. But just know that you can reuse these over and over again. So try and keep the names at least generic enough to allow for that to make sense. Now, once that's done, I can come down here and just hit OK. And when I hit OK, it's going to assign those permissions. They show up right here, and these are now global permissions. So if I were to log in as Wes, he would have read-only access to the entire environment, and he'd be able to create alarms if he ever spotted a problem. And now the VMware admins could go in and fix it, right? That's the permission he's given. And if I log in, I would be an administrator over every object in vCenter. We applied this up here at the global level. So this applies everywhere. And that's not always what we want. And so that's what leads into the next thing I want to talk about that we'll have to do in the next episode, which is assigning permissions more specifically, more like granular permissions. So we'll get a chance to see that next.
Well, Don, we appreciate the information on role-based access control, and we know we got more, but Wes the time clock watcher, other than Wes the user, definitely says that we got to wrap this one up. But before we do, you got any parting words?
Main thing here is know that it's really easy to change this stuff after the fact. So if you make a mistake, it's easy enough to go in there and clean it up, but it is just different than what we're used to. So remember that the groups don't actually go into the role. The groups get assigned a role at the time of permissions. Just a slightly different way of doing things, and it can kind of throw you for a loop. On the exam, it's not uncommon to get a practical question where they give you the UI and you actually have to set this up. So don't go editing the group trying to add a role to it, or editing the role trying to add a group to it. You go to the object you want to give permissions, and that's where you time together.
Well, Don, as always, we appreciate having you in the studios with us, and we appreciate you, the viewers, for watching. Signing out here at IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Wes Bryan.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.